Hi, welcome to Season 4 of Product Ops Podcast with me, Jirisha Nadaraju. This season, I'm joined by a special co-host and prior Season 1 guest, Dr. Kevin Sakamoto. Each week, we'll be chatting to Product Ops practitioners, consultants, and thought leaders about how they make their value visible. Listen in for practical tips on how to drive real organizational impact with Product Ops. Jessica, welcome to Product Ops Podcast Season 4. We're very excited to have you on today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm super excited to be here.
Where are you joining us from, by the way?
Atlanta. So I'm a fully remote employee in south of Atlanta.
Nice. Okay. I guess before we get into the meaty bits of this episode and this season, it would be nice maybe just to start off if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey into product ops and what your current role is and how you got there.
Full transparency, I've pretty much always been a naturally operational minded human being. It took me some time to figure that out. I definitely didn't wake up in high school and go, I want to go into ops. But I found out over time that that's just kind of where my personality fit the best. I'm very type A and organized, and I like plans and I like things to run smoothly and efficiently and all that stuff. I actually started my career in the Agile industry. And I know some people say oh, I was 18 or 19. I literally was a scrum master at 19. It was a very odd, longer story for a different day, how that came to be. For a state agency in Ohio, the gist of it was I was an intern and they were cheap. And they're like, okay, these two things match. Let's make you test this out. So I spent the vast majority of my career in the Agile world, Scrum Master, leading large-scale transformations pretty quickly, doing some public speaking and training and kind of really jumping into that Agile consultancy bandwagon when it was at its hottest. It was a great couple of years for a lot of us. And then transitioned into full-time employment, working for large enterprises, leading their internal Agile transformations. I came to my current company, Pendo, same thing, kind of helping them. They were much, much younger, very small at the time. I think roughly we were at 300-ish employees when I joined. And they knew that they were about to hit hyper growth. And at that point in time, they really hadn't established a ton of process and structure. They had a little bit, but not a lot. So they had the fortitude to be like, hey, we probably should think about this before we go from 8 teams to 34 teams. So I started out in that space, did that for a couple of years, and then moved in to support my CTO and co-founder as his chief of staff. And it was in that role that we eventually got into this space of product operations, had started over in the product world. I'd heard a little bit about it, not a ton. And we can dive into more about how I eventually got into there. But over the years, transitioned into that. But unfortunately, I was not someone who woke up and was like, I think I want to be in product ops. It was a little bit more of a voluntold kind of situation. I have since fallen in love. It is where I know I am meant to be, but wasn't on my vision board. I'll put it that way.
I love that. I think a lot of people fall into product ops or they stumble into it, basically, is usually what happens. I know for myself, it was a case of I used to be in business operations, so much more, working with chief of staff type biz ops or working with C-suite. And you're really looking at how everything's going on in the company and trying to help with more high level stuff. And then just a problem arose that was closer to the product team, and I leaned in there, and then it discovered that, there's a whole bunch of stuff that maybe needs to be looked at from an operational point of view that relates to product. So yeah, I think a lot of people happen upon it in that way.
I don't know that I've encountered anyone who didn't accidentally stumble into it.
Yeah, that is so true. Jessica, I wouldn't mind actually you unpacking that story a little bit when you were as the chief of staff, and it's almost as if how the solar system came to be, how product operations came to be in Pendo. So if you wouldn't mind sharing that story.
So I was chief of staff. I can't remember the exact timing, but I think it was maybe fall before COVID hit that spring. So we were still very much in hyper growth, uniform growth. It was kind of like magic was just sprinkled all over Pendo. If Todd, our CEO, said, let's triple revenue, we just kind of did. It was one of those types of magical moments. COVID hit, and I had transitioned the Agile team at the time to somebody that I'd hired in and was fully focused on the chief of staff role. We weren't hit as immediately with the impacts of COVID with our customers. It took us a couple of quarters to start to feel the indications of hey, companies were pulling back what they were spending. And it was about the same time that we started to feel that pain that not ironically, folks internally were starting to ask, hey, why do we have all these Scrum Masters? What do they do? Do we need this many of them? Why can't we have an engineering manager do the same type of things? Those questions started to arise. And for my consulting days, I could kind of read the writing on the wall. So I was talking to my CTO, and we were kind of thinking through what to do about the situation. And he said, why don't we just sit back, like do an objective assessment of our SDLC, our software development lifecycle. And he goes, you know enough about it, but you're not responsible anymore. So I need you to be purely objective about what's working and not working. So that kind of kicked it off. Like a lot of, I think, assessments, you start with kind of one set of scope in mind, and then it kind of continues to grow and grow as you talk to more and more people. And they're like, oh, you need to talk to this group, you need to talk to that group. What I found pretty quickly was that we had created a pretty repeatable, sustainable engineering function, meaning that the engineering teams, once they got the work to when they were done, pretty good, solid B plus from a hard grader. So that's a pretty good grade. But what I figured out was, well, that was pretty good. The ideation to engineering team phase, so like that discovery, validation, customer research, we weren't bad at it, but we were wildly inconsistent at it. And it was starting to really drive our engineers crazy, because when their PMs would shift around, right, based on what the investments were, that would wildly change the type of detail that they got, right, to work off of. And then the other piece of it, the more impactful piece, is I uncovered pretty quickly that our go-to-market, so once Eng was done, was a black box. That's probably the best way to describe it, black hole maybe. Lots of folks were very confused about what happened, when it happened, who did it, how to do it consistently. One of my favorite quotes that I often refer to is that one of our customer success managers in this listening tour was like, yeah, I love when I hear what Pendo released when a customer calls me and tells me that it's broken. Meaning like that was like her first experience knowing that we had released that functionality. So my assessment was essentially that a couple of things. We had these two pockets of a larger life cycle that weren't really being given a ton of consistent attention to. And then as a part of that, I also started to investigate sounds too harsh. I started to learn more about what our internal product ops team was doing, because it was still a pretty new function to Pendo. And while they were doing their absolute best to add value, and it was still like a lot of early product ops teams where it was kind of all over the place, right? A lot of tasks that no one else wanted to do. It was really trying to optimize the PM's time. But what it had created unintentionally was a ton of handoffs and interactions that just weren't working super well across that whole life cycle. So like they would come in and out. Our Scrum Masters would kind of come in and out because of that, balancing it out. So when we stepped back and we looked at it, transparently, I made this recommendation, not thinking that they would ask me to go lead this transformation. But I was like, I recommended this idea of transitioning these process people, meaning Agilists. Agilists, at the end of the day, they're just operational process-minded human beings, and getting them to own this larger life cycle. So instead of them just owning Eng start to Eng done, they now were going to be responsible for owning from the beginning of the idea all the way through its adoption into customer hands, and then creating this larger iterative cycle of, okay, because of the company that we are, being a product analytics tool, we need to close that loop of once it's in customer hands, feeding it back into the product managers, like front of their vision into, hey, here's what's happening with your product now that it's out there, and then letting them use that data to iterate their roadmaps. So we, as a part of that, we kind of played back and forth and just eventually landed on needing to change their title. It was more of a psychology thing. We could have left them as Scrum Masters. Frankly, I don't know that it would have really mattered in the sense of the job description, but we needed them to stop thinking and acting purely as Scrum Masters in the engineering teams. And we needed to think about this larger ecosystem. So we landed on this title of program management, decided that to position them in the right way, since they owned now this product development lifecycle, we needed them to sit in product and not sit in engineering. So made this big proposal. Our CPO was on board, CTO was on board, and then they turned around and they said, hey, why don't you lead this transformation? And as a part of it, we want to fold the product operations team into it as well and start to really evolve their mission, their vision, the value that they are providing to the organization. We want to make it so it feels less administrative and more strategic and impactful. So we kind of did all of that shifting all at once.
That's great. That's a whole podcast in itself, that particular story. And what I love about it is it shows that holistic breadth, like you seeing the need from an organizational perspective, but also operating on a micro level as well by saying, okay, we need to improve these processes. Like this part is good, right? The engineering to delivery, but then the beginning part is not so good. So having that full spectrum of vision, right, is important for that. And it's interesting to hear you talk about COVID because that's when I first got into product operations as well. So there seems to be this wave of when product ops is needed, and things are going
Yeah.
good, we need it, right? And then when things
That's
get,
actually when I started in product ops around
Look at
2020.
We're all COVID product ops babies.
Wow. Yeah.
yeah. And then it's interesting when things are not so good, right? Then product ops is usually one of the roles to be cut. So I'm curious to hear your take on this, given that you were sort of the founder almost, right? Of product ops in Pendo. Do you see product ops as a transitory or temporary role, or is it something that should be here to stay?
So I want to give credit where credit's due. I was not technically the founder. Christine was the visionary originally for how product ops was at Pendo. And like many, she was doing the absolute best that she could with what we knew about the idea of product ops at the time, right? So I more so just got to take her base and continue to evolve it. If I'm being really, really honest, I did benefit from two things that I think are somewhat unique to my situation. One was that as a product industry leader that Pendo is, there was really never an option for them to not have product operations. Meaning, whereas other companies obviously have a little bit more flexibility, right? If they're not thought leaders in this industry, they can kind of ebb and flow, to your point, a little bit more. We knew that this was going to be, to answer your question, something to stay. We knew that product operations wasn't going to go away as a concept, and therefore we had to figure out what our point of view was on it and how we could make it work. The other thing that was unique to me is, and I vehemently stand by this, doing an assessment like that. I'm not saying you cannot do it as the owner of one of those teams, like meaning as the owner of the Agile team or the owner of an operations team. But because I had no skin in the game directly, I was able to be a lot more objective about the entirety of the situation. And I've reflected back on that a lot now because it's natural to be attached to the team you're responsible for and the people that you're responsible for and have somewhat of blinders to that. And so I think that position also helped me in that assessment. I do think, just to repeat, that it's not going anywhere. If anything, in this world of flashy AI everywhere, everything, I very much believe that your operations humans are going to be the last ones standing because someone's got to turn the bots on and make sure the bots are talking to each other appropriately. So I don't think it's going anywhere. I do think that it fits more naturally right now with slightly larger companies. I think that it's not that it's not applicable to like your mid-market, smaller companies, but it's way more value impact like driving in your larger organizations where they're trying to get as much out of their product organization as humanly possible.
I think those are great points. Also, Jessica, just on the size part of it with that scaling, needing product ops, I think once you're scaling, either going into like hyperscale or, in a very large organization, I do agree with that. I did product ops at a startup and then a scale up and now quite a large, in a way, more corporate style company, but it's just huge. There's in my remit of scope, I've got 60 plus product teams, cross-functional product teams or squads, to try and just the sheer, and when you've got inconsistency, it's not that there's everything's bad or everything's good. It's just that there's inconsistency. And when other stakeholders have to deal with inconsistency across potentially 60 different product managers or squads, it does mean that you need somebody who can start looking at those things and seeing like how it's just, you can't fix that with each team trying to just do that themselves. And so I think that size element also definitely does tend to make it, more important. Yeah, I like what you said, and I like that you also acknowledge those 2 points in the context. Because I think also product ops and the way people choose to tackle it, and it's often the same problems that we're trying to solve, but the way you set your team up and the way you do stuff internally will depend heavily on the context of the company that you're in. And so I know, like you mentioned, the program managers or scrum masters, maybe it's a bit topical. I mean, I've seen articles written by thought leaders and whatever about like product ops shouldn't be this and it shouldn't be that and it shouldn't be, but they're not in your company on the ground facing the reality of the problems that you have. And if you find a setup that works in a way, that is still looking at those problems, but you've got to work with what you have and you're leveraging that, From being on the ground and a practitioner, I really don't have so much a judgment. And I think sometimes people come at it quite harshly, and it should be this, it shouldn't be that, when really you're dealing with lots of variables in your company.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And given my Agile background, I have a decently hot take in what the Agile industry did wrong and what I'm hoping the product ops industry does not repeat, which is please don't write a product ops manifesto. Please do not write a product ops guide that is 12 pages that everyone treats like this religious document that it becomes what you're describing, right? Which is this very black and white. It must be this, it has to be that. I don't think that this industry would benefit from that. Like it is highly contextual because it is very much based on what your company needs. And frankly, at that time, like what I mentioned about what Christine started at Pendo is what Pendo needed at the time. What it evolved to need naturally changes. And if let's say we flash forward 3 years and somebody else is leading product ops at Pendo, I hope that they continue to evolve it to what the company needs at that time versus feeling stuck in some predefined definition. And I will say, I think it's lovely to hear folks in the product operations industry start to lean heavier and heavier into this point of view of like, no, it's contextual and it's okay that it's contextual. Like it's
Yeah, that's okay. I guess sort of using that as a segue into, I think one of the things that you do need to do in product ops, though, is deliver value, right? So you've got a lot of it is internal customers. You need to be able to show that the function is delivering value and working within these kind of ambiguous roles. It's not like the product manager or the UX or the engineer, which has more defined ways of working. Product ops can be so many different things, but the key thing is, are you delivering value to your stakeholders and doing good work that's actually helpful to people? And so that is the theme for this season. It's about making value visible. So instead of saying work visible, I actually think it's the value that you're adding that we've got to make visible. And oftentimes the work that we do goes unnoticed or it's in the background, so it's hard to do that. So I would love to find out from you, Jessica. Maybe you've kind of set it up a bit in terms of this transformation that you went through and bringing in, the different teams and the assessment. But is there kind of like one example of an initiative or a piece of work that you or your team did that stood out as something that was very valuable and, resulted in impact in Pendo? And we'd love to just find out a bit more about that, give us a bit of context and tell us how you approached it.
As I'm thinking through it, I know that we kind of were prepping beforehand and I had talked about some stuff, but if it's okay with you, I almost have two examples if I can cheat and not just give one. So, and it goes back to kind of how you define product ops. Like there is starting to become this narrative around what the major pillars of product ops might look like, right? And folks might have slightly different variations of it. One of the biggest things is around data, right? Product data, tool utilization data, all those types of things. For Pendo, because of I hate to say unique because everyone's unique in their own way, but because of our use case where we build a product analytics tool, our PMs are probably ahead of the curve when it comes to how to use that data, how to find that data, how to put that data back into their roadmap thinking and validation, all of that. So when we were thinking about those pillars for product ops for us, it was like, well, we can't ignore data. That can't just be a thing we don't do just because our PMs are better at it than some or most. So we started to look at where the gaps still existed. And one of the early things that I think we've brought value with is the aggregate data. So while our individual PMs might be good at looking at their part of the product and the data that makes sense to them to justify a continued roadmap or to adjust a strategy or whatever, we try to approach it from across the entire product. So we try to look at it like, hey, we're this voice two ways. One, so that PMs can see outside of their world. We want to give them a viewpoint that is like, okay, here's what all your peers are doing, and here's what the rest of the product is doing so that you have a relative comparison, right? So like if you get too close to your own tree, you might be like, oh, this data looks great. But if you step back a second and go, oh, compared to this one right next to me, maybe it's not that great. Maybe I could be doing something slightly different. And then also we like to communicate to obviously my CPO who I report to, as well as our C team, so that they can also get cross-product information. I think something is clearly valuable when it starts to go viral across all departments in your company. So how does this look? A couple of things. We started really small with just how do we incorporate more aggregate data into our operating model at Pendo. So how product and engineering operate together, meaning when we do like roadmap reviews on a monthly basis, how much of our data are we pulling into that? When we do quarterly reviews of how our product strategies are going, making sure that we are looking at the aggregate level of data. Even more recently, increasing that to become a part of the board presentation at the end of quarters, where we create a slide that our CPO utilizes that shows a certain time period, typically the last quarter, what has been released at normally at a certain level or above. So not every single nitty-gritty release, but at a certain level or above. And then what's adoption and engagement look like? How is the company looking at what's it invested versus what's it getting out of it from its customer usage point of view? Those have all been, I don't know if call them baby steps because they felt really monumental to us, but definitely big improvements and clear value that we are adding. And then the final one that went viral was we started creating this monthly product newsletter that, while it comes from the voice of our CPO, all the meat in that newsletter comes from our product operations team. And it's this really cool monthly email, frankly, that breaks down similar things, right? What's the latest trends in our product usage? What parts of the product are going really well? Which ones are struggling? And we're asking for calls to action from our go-to-market teams and from our sellers to be thinking about how to position them differently. And we get a ton of positive feedback. And it's probably the only thing, frankly, that I've ever experienced where I get sellers, customer success, ops people, engineers, product people, they all will respond to the email, and they just give shout out after shout out to the product operations team for surfacing that data. And it's gotten to the point where we're actually starting to now use that, and we're getting requested to create a template version, so a safe version that doesn't have private Pendo data in it, right? To be able to start sharing with our customers to say, hey, look, you guys can create this too with the same one functionality, but also just utilizing Pendo to surface this data.
I love that. I was just pausing because I know, Kevin, you probably got questions too, but let me do some and then you can. I think, that's it feels like it's so simple, right? Like to do a newsletter.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we forget about the simple things that you can do. But with that newsletter, did you start with one audience in mind? Because this is the thing sometimes where if you try to do something for everyone, because everybody has an ask, then you end up just not either being able to do it or it becomes too difficult to please all these different audiences. So how did you start that, or who did you focus in on?
It actually came out of, we do this quarterly meeting that we call a product impact O&I, and it's a cross-functional meeting. It's pretty big. I'm not going to lie to you. It's pretty expensive, but it's beautiful in that it's not just the product organization reading out to the rest of the business. It's bi-directional. So we have presenters from each of the major departments from the business side. They start the meeting by presenting to us their point of view on customer insights. What are they hearing in the field? What does the day-to-day really look like? What's challenging for renewals? Like stuff like that, right? So they bring those types of points of view to us. And then product ends the meeting with the second half of it being all about insights into what's usage look like, what have we released recently, what's coming up on roadmap. And the whole goal there is to kind of make sure we're finding those intersections of, are the things that we're starting to build and solve for meeting the needs of what you guys are seeing in the field every single day. So we started with that meeting. Our CPO requested that we move in that direction. As a part of that, we were driving to how much aggregate data can we use in the meeting. Out of that, as we started to see some success with that meeting, then it became clear that, hey, that's obviously, while it's a big meeting, it's still not the entire company. It's still not a really large swath of humans. So then the request changed to, hey, how do we have a similar kind of like whole business viewpoint that we can easily send out across larger swaths of people? So I will say it did start, the first request for this newsletter started as, I want to send this out to all of product. And then it became quickly, well, for instance, all of products, one of our core values has always been centered around transparency. Why hold it back? Why not send it out to the next request was, well, engineering builds the things we're sending. So maybe we send it out to engineering too and let them see kind of the output of the work that they do. Well, if we're sending out to engineering and product, might as well just send it out. What's much more by sending out to the rest of the company? It is quite a significant lift, but it just seemed like a really natural thing. We've only sent I think we just on our third this week. And like I said, response has been really, really positive.
What's fascinating here is the responses, as you mentioned, that it's been positive. And every one of these mediums you're talking about, there's been positive response. So communication as a product, it's in itself does not add value. A communication template does not add value. Yet you are bringing significant amounts of value to these communication pieces because you're talking about well, there's a lot of response and across different divisions, and there's all this positive feedback, and now it's being templatized. What do you attribute that to? Because I know I've tried in the past to standardize communication and seeing it as a product, and it doesn't quite seem to work. So I'm curious to know what you would attribute that to.
Yeah, I feel like this is one area I definitely can't take total credit for. I think that as a company, we have a really ingrained value around data, 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 all things data all the time. I mean, it makes sense, right? Given the products that we build. And so I think it gave us a boost from the beginning of everyone at Pendo is so ingrained and we want to have data and see data and talk about data as much as possible. So that helped for sure. But then I think it doesn't hurt that the data that we're presenting about the usage of our product is a pretty natural transition, even if you're a seller, into how does this impact my day-to-day job? Well, if I'm seeing how we're adapting these parts of the product, it gives me more ammo to position it when I'm selling it or when I'm renewing a customer, or if I'm in customer success, it gives me more insight into, well, where can I anticipate problems arising, right? If I can already see through some of these communications that we're having adoption issues in X, Y, or Z feature, okay, I'm going to be proactive and I'm going to go ahead and assume I'm going to get more phone calls. So let me go into our content management system and go find as much research as I can to activate myself so that when the calls come in, I'm ready to handle them. When I'm product, how do I start to look at building a whole product versus just my segment? And having information like this really helps me think about that larger system, which I think other companies I've been at before, we've always missed that part. Like we've always missed the how do you cohesively bring it all together? And I'm not going to sit here and tell you guys that we are perfect at this by any means. We are still working on it, but I think that they're really positive steps forward.
That's very fascinating because it seems as if data is the lifeblood, obviously, of Pendo, versus in other companies where you might be selling stuff, whatever products they might be selling. You have then different priorities. I need to sell more of this product versus this product, or I have this marketing campaign that I want to do over this marketing campaign. So the idea of product operations or even communication as a product and adding value to that loses some of its strength when you have data as a product that runs throughout the entire organization. Everybody can rally around that and seize the value.
I'm going to challenge that just a little bit because we just like any other business, we still have the sales challenge of increasing cross sell, of increasing expansion. But I think what's cool about what product operations can do at any business is that it drives a different kind of conversation. So like we had an entire company OKR last year around increasing cross sell. New products need to go to existing customers more so, right? Simply put. And transparently, we were seeing the results of that OKR weren't nearly as positive as we were all hoping for as a company. The thing I think product ops adds value to that conversation is it gives you the actual product data and utilization and adoption information to be able to drive conversations about why. So like if let's say you're trying to upsell, we'll just play completely benign here, product A, and product A is not cross-selling the way that you want it to. Well, if you dig into some of the user data and our ability to also look at session replays, meaning we can literally watch what our customers are doing, we can have a much more thoughtful conversation about what is happening with why that cross-sell isn't improving. And I think that just naturally elevates the value that a product operations team is seeing outside of even just product. Because now other departments are going, wow, this is super useful.
Yeah. On that, I guess, are you trying to be proactive with your team in anticipating the data needs that these different users will have and then getting that information to them? Or are they sort of like pulling on your team to say, hey, we have this OKR and we need some data to help us? Or you're looking at that and saying, we need to get this data to be able to make those decisions?
It's definitely a mix of all of the above. I wish I could tell you that I was like Superwoman and like could predict everyone's ask and requests. I do think spending time in a chief of staff role has helped me be slightly more proactive because as you mentioned, like having a similar role, I think that it gives you a context of the business that I just wouldn't have had otherwise. Which has really helped me think about what the business might need. And then I will say having program management as a part of product operations helps us be a lot more proactive as well because our program managers run our company OKRs. So they also offer me insight into, hey, I'm on this OKR and we're doing X, Y, and Z in it. And I think that this kind of information would be really helpful company wide or within this certain segment of internal users. So the two sitting side by side often helps us be slightly more proactive than natural, but we definitely still get requests. The newsletter that I mentioned that has been such a good success, that was 100% my CPO's idea. He came to me and said, hey, I want to do this. Can you guys help us pull together the content and the information in it?
Hmm. And I guess with the rollout of this particular initiative that has been successful, I was just curious, did you have to face any challenges along the way? Because it seems like you kind of were just rolling out an MVP and then getting good feedback and then iterating on that and getting good feedback and getting good feedback. Were there any challenges or problems? And I guess what kind of skills did the people on your team or yourself need to be able to deliver this and have good value?
One of the biggest challenges I would say with the newsletter itself is might sound silly, but it's the visualization of it. We are not an email company in the first place. So the idea of sending a very long email was a hurdle in and of itself. How to get people to read it, how to get people to keep scrolling. That was definitely a big challenge. I'm huge in just giving credit where it's supposed to go. So like we didn't solve that by ourselves. We had to work with our design team and they were absolutely incredible partners to help us figure out what's the right visualization, how can we break up the content to make sure that people keep going, how do we utilize headlines to draw attention, those types of things. That was definitely a hurdle when it comes to the newsletter. The operating cadence, change management, it is getting people to commit to new meetings, new cadences, getting them to buy into the value of those things, especially when you talk about changing old behaviors. And if they question the value of those old behaviors, convincing them that the new behavior will somehow magically be more beneficial to them. We definitely faced a lot of that. The skill set that I think we deployed the most within both the program management team and the product operations team when it came to improving our operating cadence was one that they were a united front. So our program managers tackled it on the more day-to-day point of view. They work with our leadership teams across our program. So they were able to help us kind of be those constant marketers of here's the value, here's the thing you're going to get. Whereas product operations was really, really good at being able to recognize where we should be able to have more so guidelines than hardcore process, and then where slightly more strict and consistent process was needed. And for our internal teams, knowing that they have a little bit of that flexibility and that it's not constantly one size fits all for everybody buys us some credibility. So having that balance was really, really helpful.
That's such a great point, and it's such an important skill or thing to call out because a lot of what you do can feel a little bit like you're herding cats or whatever it is. Like you're constantly having to tell people, like in order to get adoption of what you're putting in place, you often need to put into place like meetings or new communications, or they need to do something too in order to make this work.
Yeah.
And getting that buy-in or getting them to change their behavior, these key stakeholders or leaders or whoever it is so key, like in order to have any impact.
One really small thing that I think we almost did kind of unconsciously, but then realized that it was helpful and really latched onto it is we try as much as possible to call it our operating cadence and not our process. Process is definitely a word that some folks in our organization are still allergic to. So wherever we can not use that word and just this is how we operate. This is how we operate as a group. And that seems to help with some of that change management. I'm not going to say it's perfect and that it's like a magic wand kind of thing, but definitely helps.
I love that. I just want to double click on it there. Language and operating cadence sounds something that I would want to engage in. And I feel like I can add some, or I can learn from as well. I can add to it, I can learn from it. How important is the language when it comes to product operations?
Personal opinion, I think language is everything. We were actually just talking about a new improvement that we want to continue to evolve. So we're like many companies, we're trying to figure out how does AI fit into our world, and AI development is very different than traditional SaaS development. I can't believe that we're saying traditional SaaS development. Like that's just a weird phrase to me still. But we're trying to figure that out too. So we were actually talking about terminology this whole week. And right now we use a pretty traditional epics, stories, tasks kind of breakdown. And our senior product leadership team was exploring this idea of like, what if we change to bets, experiments, and tasks? And like, even though it is literally the same, I'm whispering like my teams can hear me, even though it is literally the same technical breakdown of organizing an idea, the terminology can really change how somebody interacts and is willing to play with a concept. Similar, like circling all the way back to that assessment. When I first proposed this big change, I didn't think twice about naming them Scrum Masters. That's all I ever knew, and it made sense to me. But then when we were thinking and talking about the psychology of the ask that we were asking them to do, that the word mattered, the name mattered a lot. And I don't think we would have been as successful had we not changed their name. We can talk about that a little bit more, but I think to answer your question, I think terminology matters a ton and is oftentimes undervalued, especially I feel like the larger your organization gets, sometimes some, I just call them more corporate humans, I think definitely minimize how impactful what you call something is.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think I've also been on the other side of that where, sometimes you just get founders or people who change the names of things that don't need to be changed. Like, do you know what I mean? Like,
Also true.
where you're like, why can't we just say this word? This is not anything that's gonna spark debate or whatever. Why are you choosing to just change that? So I think I've been in a couple of those situations. It's like, oh, why
We
can't we just
actually
call it a thing? Yeah.
we have one of those. We have a
Yes.
founder who needs the phrase architect.
Okay.
It has been an 11-year battle in Pendo.
Exactly. So there's some things where I guess they get a free pass and they can choose what they want. But I do think that was a great question too, Kevin, around that language thing. I see that definitely as something important.
All right. So thank you, Jessica. The perspective that you bring and language matters. And it seems that you have a unique perspective given your time as a chief of staff. You're able to see things at a different view and from a different vantage point. And that skill is something that not a lot of people have. So I'm wondering though, given your perspective and given all your skills and experience, what is now one of the hardest things about being in product operation that people really don't talk about?
Two things come to mind. One is that it is still at its core an operations role, which can oftentimes be oversimplified and undervalued. And then the other thing that I would say is not difficult for me, but I have seen this with other teams and I sit in a unique spot. I still to this day support both engineering and products to a degree. And so sitting on the fence of both of them has brought immense value to my product operations team. And I don't often see companies taking that direction. Like I've actually talked to quite a few in the industry and a conversation I was just having earlier this week with another product operations leader was I mentioned something about engineering. She said, no, that's not my remit. Like I'm just product. And at least from my point of view, I understand that there are definitely companies where that is probably more separate. And the larger you get, the more support that you get to run both of those orgs. But for us, considering and constantly thinking about the two of them as two halves to one whole and that they both have to function together effectively and efficiently, I think has made us more valuable to the organization as a whole. So I know that's kind of a weird roundabout way of answering it, but that the first one is probably the more direct answer, which is it is still an operations function, which like any operations function, when things are going great, it's an easy sell. You oftentimes don't get the kudos for it going well. But when things go wrong, you're absolutely the one pinpointed for why is this functioning this way? Why have you not fixed this? Those types of things. And I don't think Prod Ops is free of that challenge. I think it's any operations role, you have to show up every day and be willing to show value. And in my experience, not enough operations people remember that. I think I was probably scarred as a consultant because as a consultant, right, like your contract is technically a day in, day out type of thing. If you make the wrong executive mad, if the budget goes sideways, insert whatever other reason, they can cut your contract whenever they feel like it. And so when I was in that space as my source of income, I learned real quick, I better show up every day and prove that you want to pay me, you want to keep me here. And I've carried a lot of that mentality into my corporate job, which is a lot more comfortable, right? And a lot more stable. And I've tried to instill it in a slightly less scary way to my team members about like, we've got to show up and you've got to be willing to put the work in and provide value every day. And there's going to be days where you're going to sit there and scratch your head and go, I don't know how I added value today. But instead of sticking it, like focusing on that, what's tomorrow look like? How do you add value tomorrow? And getting comfortable as an operations person to really believe that you are strategic. You are not just a coordinator of meetings, a cap herder, a facilitator. You have incredible insight and input that is valuable to the folks that you're working with, and building the confidence in my team to be willing to speak up in some of these sessions and show that they are also strategic, I think has been really critical and helped to solve for that. We're not just an operations team. You don't want to cut us just because the belt needs tightened. You need us, and you need us critically. And I will say, little success in my whole team right now. I give them a shout out. Pendo, like many companies, are doing some financial replanning. The year is a very difficult year for a lot of companies in the US, the world, frankly. And I'm super proud to say that like our team is not being impacted. We're not being looked at as this expensive cost center, this question mark of value. It doesn't mean that we're not like anybody else and we're not going to kind of freeze hiring or do some of those other things to be financially responsible. But it's the first time in my entire career that I felt completely confident that they are not going to look at us as like the easy thing to cut.
Mm. That's amazing. I mean, that's really great because that is the thing that Kevin and I have actually been talking about. And we asked you at the beginning, do you think
Yeah.
it's like a transitory role? Because oftentimes it is the first area to be cut because it's ops, product ops doesn't seem as important. So that in itself is kind of a testament to, I think, what the theme of the podcast, which is trying to make sure that you are delivering value in this type of role, which is awesome.
I have one tiny little tangent, if it's okay, on that providing value. Something that has helped me and my team is this almost life lesson of if what you're doing doesn't land with your leadership, with your peers, with anybody, I've oftentimes seen operations people get really frustrated at almost like a blame game of they just don't get it, they don't see it, like. And what I try to challenge myself and my team too is if it's not landing, that's our responsibility. Like we need to change our behaviors and change how we're communicating to find the thing that resonates with them versus getting upset that, well, the first way that we attempted it didn't land the right way. And that's been pretty game changing for my team as well. It frustrates them because they'll come to me sometimes, like normal behavior, right? And they'll be like, such and such didn't go the way I wanted it to. I didn't get the recognition or it didn't win or whatever. And I'm like, okay, cool. What are you going to change? Like, what are you going to do differently? And they're like, what? And I'm like, well, they're not going to change. We have no control over that. What are you doing? And so we still work through that on day to day, but I think it's a really important lesson to learn in any ops role.
Yeah.
But you got to find the way to make it land with them, not expect them to change.
Yeah, I love that. I've been trying to say a version of that to my team, but probably not as eloquently or as punchy as what you just said. So I'm definitely going to use that with them. But I think it is the case where oftentimes I'm saying chasing these stakeholders, trying to get their input or drive things forward with them, and they've got a million other things going on. And I have seen it where you've then got team members who are doing the right things. They're communicating, they're telling people about deadlines, it's asking for their input, they're doing things, but they're not getting the response back, right? And then they feel like, oh no, but I've sent this and I've sent that and I've sent this and I've done that and I'm not getting it back. And I think something I'm also trying to do is, well, if we're communicating and communicating, it's not landing and we're not getting the action, what can we do to change that or change the message? Or if you're showing people dashboards of data and they're not interested, okay, but why? Maybe it's not the information that they really care about, because if they cared about it, maybe then they would be pulling to get it. So yeah, it is also trying to gently change that way of thinking.
Totally. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's actually great life advice too, Jessica. What can you do differently yourself, right? To
So
get some.
again, giving credit where it's due, my CTO, when I was the chief of staff, he was adamant about reminding me that the responsibility of communication is not on the one listening, it's on the one speaking. And it has hit my soul deeply, even when it is very frustrating sometimes.
Thank you for sharing that story. And so related to that, things hitting your soul deeply, product operations can be a lonely role. It's thankless. It can be tiring. What do you do to stay motivated and energized?
Oh man, that's a great question. What do I do to stay motivated and energized? I focus a lot on claiming wins as a team. And a part of that is like as a leader of people managers now, I've had to adjust somewhat what success looks like. Like earlier in my career, I used to think that success was me personally doing a bunch of things, even if I had a few team members that would report to me. And it was a kind of rough adjustment to learn that, like, no, my job is to build the absolute best possible team. And if my team is kicking butt, I won't curse, kicking butt, then that means that I'm doing the right things. And so in the last for sure in this transformation, that was a huge part of it. I had to take folks who were Agilists through and through and convince them to follow me into this really scary, weird world of product. None of us had ever worked outside of engineering. And so I think focusing on their success, them feeling value, them feeling growth in their career, them like all of those things. It's kind of cheesy, but I love it. I love seeing them expand. We've had a couple of our folks move into product management roles because of where they're positioned now in the business. We've had opportunities where people can see way more of the organization and can figure out, hey, maybe I do want to go into RevOps, or maybe I want to go into sales enablement, and watching them have just a bigger view of possibilities has been really, really invigorating. And then I am very lucky. I work with a bunch of very incredible people. I love my CTO and my CPO. They are both very, very good humans. And I get to be quite sarcastic and myself and authentic with them, which is always great when it comes to the thing you do for 40 hours plus a week.
Yeah, I think the people that you work with and whether you can show up as your authentic self helps so much in making sure that it doesn't feel so draining. And in this role, you have to tackle problems every day and there are challenges. So you need to feel like you've got people around you who I guess are supportive or get it, or you can just like relax a little bit with. I think that's really good advice. I guess our final question to you, Jessica, we've loved chatting to you and all the insights that you've given along the way, but you've been doing product ops for a while now, and you also bring this interesting background of, kind of chief of staff and agile. But I'm wondering, has your view on product operations changed now versus when you first got into it, or maybe when you weren't even in it, but you were viewing it from the outside and looking in? Has it changed, and if so, how?
It definitely has changed for sure. I think the criticality of it has continued to increase for me. And as we've seen success in what we've done with the go-to-market space, I think what I've really come to realize is that it's not that far off where every revenue or sales team has a RevOps or a sales ops that is critical to their success as an organization. I don't think prod ops and product are all that far behind that, like that level of it. I think we're like maybe a year or two before every product organization goes, I have to have a product ops, even if it's a single person or two people. It doesn't mean it has to be this giant organization, but I do think that has evolved for me. If you would have asked me that 2 years ago, I probably wouldn't have had that point of view. Not that I didn't value it, but I don't think at that time I truly understood just how much impact it could have on an organization, and how, given the constant ups and downs of the global economy, like how much it can help optimize the PMs you have, optimize the output you are already creating as an organization without having to go spend more money on more humans or more tools or these other things. So I do think that it's on a path for, like I said, it kind of becoming this like lifeblood, this heartbeat to product organizations.
Amazing. Kevin, any final thoughts or questions to Jessica before we let her go?
No, Jessica, really thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate your insight and your unique perspective. And I love the conversation about psychology and terminology, and we could have a whole separate episode just about that. So thank you.
Happy to. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, we've loved chatting to you. And if, I guess, anybody else wants to get in touch with you based on if they've liked the things that you've spoken about here and want to ask you more questions, what's the best way for them to do that?
LinkedIn is probably the easiest, most straightforward one.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jessica. This has been great.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please remember to rate, follow, and subscribe to Product Ops Podcast across our channels, including Substack. Even better, share it with your friends and colleagues in Product Ops, as that helps others find it. Thanks, and take care.